GameSci.com. GameSci.com.
Hello everybody, I'm Professor Chris Ferguson. It's been a while since I've done one of these videos, so please bear with me. It always takes me a little bit to get the rust off. JavaScript built-in objects. Built-ins are automatically available for the programmers. You don't have to do anything to use them. They're just there and available all the time. The window object and the document object are things we've already used quite a bit. We'll go into much more detail on them in this slide. The math object and the history object are also built in. We'll concentrate on the math object in this presentation. Let's start with what we know. You know variables. Simple variables. Variables are computer memory that hold values. At this point in the course, you have created and used many variables. You can see I create a hero equals Thor. That's a simple variable. I store a single value in the variable hero. Weapon equals hammer. I'm going to assign hammer, the weapon of choice for Thor, to the weapon variable. These are simple variables and you've used many of them in your program so far. Function attack. You know functions. You've written functions so far in this course. This is a simple function. Create a function that uses variables. At this point of the course, you have created and used many functions. Thor swings a hammer. What this attack function is going to do is use the variables to issue a message that describes an attack by Thor. Thor swings a hammer when he wants to attack his opponents. An object is a set of variables and a set of functions. An object is two things we already know. A set of variables, just like the variables we have created and used, and a set of functions that we have written and used. You know functions, you know variables. That's what an object is composed of. Objects are variables that have variables and functions. It's like a conglomerate. It's multiple things packaged together into one entity called an object. Let's look at a line of code here. Object dot or period hero equals Thor. Now recall that the last time we just said hero equals Thor. Now we're adding this object dot. That says go to this object variable and inside it you will find a variable called hero. Set it equal to Thor. An object is a variable that has variables inside of it. Go to the object variable. The dot or period says go inside the object and access the hero variable and assign it Thor. We're not going to this standalone variable. We're going over here to this variable inside the object. Object.weapon equals hammer. Once again, look at the arrow. We're going to go to this object variable. The dot says go inside and change the weapon variable inside the object to hammer. It's a simple change really. Instead of weapon equals hammer, to change the global variable hammer, which is right down here, we're going to place an object dot in front of it to change the variable weapon that is inside the object. The global and object variables are different. This is the variable we created earlier, all by itself. This is a variable that's inside the object. Object dot attack. Go to the object variable once again. Inside it you will find an attack function. Run that attack function. Objects also have functions. This code goes inside of object dot to run the attack function. Now how do I know it's a function? It's the parentheses. Notice the parentheses here. The parentheses tell us that this is a function. The variable hero up here, no parentheses, that's a variable. Down here, attack must be a function because look at those two parentheses that follow it. Get to know the dot operator. It's important to spot what this means when you see it. The dot operator says go inside the object and access a variable or function. Which is which? Depends on the parentheses. Here the dot operator accesses a variable. Down here the dot operator is accessing the attack function inside the object variable. Object dot. I use the variable name object to hammer into your head this is an object. Pun intended. This is an object. They won't always be called object. We have the window object, we have the document object. In that case it's window dot something, document dot something. But I use the name object to be very, very literal that we are accessing an object which has a hero variable and a weapon variable and an attack. When you see something like window.location equals, this means that window is an object and location is a variable inside of it. When you see something like document.write with the parentheses, this means the document object and its write function. Document is an object, write is a function. You'll also see things like history.go -1. Go must be a function. It has parentheses. Math.py, that's got to be a variable. It doesn't have parentheses. So in this case, history and math are objects, pi is a variable, and go is a function. Be object aware. Notice or recognize the specific elements by looking at the code. Variable versus property. This is just a naming convention. They're not different. They just go by different names. A property is a variable that is part of an object. Calling them properties makes it clear they are part of an object. When it's outside of object, we tend to treat hero and weapon as variables. When they're inside of an object, we prefer to cross out this variable and call it a property. A property is just a more specific term that tells you or implies that this must be part of an object. Function versus method. Attack must be a function because look at those parentheses. But methods are functions that are part of an object. Properties and methods are just more object-oriented terms than variable and function. When something is outside of an object, we tend to refer to them as variable and function. When they're inside the object, we tend to call these properties and methods. Just be object aware. When you spot that dot operator, that period, it signals that you are dealing with an object. All of this is signaling that this is an object to the left. To the left of the dot is the object. Now if you see window dot or document dot or math dot, that's telling you window, document, and math are objects. Now to the right of the period or the dot is a property, aka variable of the object, like hero or weapon. I know these are variables or properties because they don't have parentheses. To the right of the dot could also be a function or method. You know when it's a function or method by the parentheses. So objects have two main components. Variables are sometimes called properties to indicate this is definitely part of an object. Objects have methods or functions. Again, method is just a more specific term. It implies that this thing is part of an object. I tend to use method and function interchangeably. I tend to use property and variable interchangeably. Just get used to it. Different object-oriented programmers have different terms for these. They won't always be properties. Sometimes they call them attributes. Won't always be methods. Sometimes people call these actions or behaviors. There's lots of different terminology. Just start getting used to it. Read the built-in object documentation. Google JavaScript window object or JavaScript document object to learn more about these two built-in objects. Whew, that wraps up this slide. Remember, they're called methods when they're part of an object. Function is a less specific term. Method is a more specific term. They're called properties instead of variables when they are part of an object. Just get used to the terminology. It'll take a while. I kind of interchange the two terms. Good luck, and let's move on to the window object. The window object. Clearly one of the most important built-in objects there is. I would call it the mother of all JavaScript objects because everything else is part of the window object. The window object represents an open window in the browser. If you've opened up a web page, you have a window that you're viewing on the screen. That is the window object. Like all objects, it has variables and it has methods. Let's look at one of each. Here's a line of code. URL equals window.location. Go to the window object and access its location variable, extract what's in the location variable, and assign it to the URL. Go to the built-in window object. The dot says go inside the object and access the location variable and assign that value to the URL variable. And you can see it's pulling this value, abc.com, out of the window object and storing it in the URL variable. Window.alert and pass it this parameter. Once again, go to the built-in window object. There it is. The dot operator says go inside that object and run the alert method. Now, how do I know it's a method? Because of the parentheses. I'll pass it this parameter, and it'll put a display box on the browser window. So this command goes to the window object and runs this method. This method pops up that alert box with that message in it. See where the URL colon comes from? Right there. Where does the abc.com come from? It comes from the URL variable that we pulled out earlier. Window.location equals http://espn.com. You've seen this before. We've looked at the location variable before. We are actually going to change which web page is being displayed. If you change the value stored in the location variable of the window object, it will switch your web page over to that new URL. It used to be abc.com. The page will now display espn.com. We told the window we want its location to be different, so it changes the page that it was displaying. And to be honest with you, above here, I was kind of doing a little extra. I don't have to do this window dot here and a window dot here and a window dot here. The window dot is not a requirement. It turns out so many commands would start with window dot. JavaScript automatically does a window dot in front of alert and in front of location. So I don't have to say window dot alert. I can just call alert. I don't have to say window.location. I can just use the location variable. It's assumed that it's the variable that's part of the window object. And it does pretty much the same thing. It'll go to the location variable, which contains an espn.com, and now you'll see espn.com on the alert box. It's all pretty simple. The thing that kind of confuses people is you don't have to put the window dot in front of it. It doesn't hurt to do window.alert, but you don't have to because alert is assumed to be part of the window object. You don't have to type in window.location because the window dot is assumed in any variable you use without a dot in front of it. It's going to assume it's part of the window object. Ooh, here's a juicy line of code. obj equals window.document.getElementById p1. Go to the built-in window object, and it turns out the document object is part of the window object. It's literally a property of the window object. We go inside of that object and we run its getElementById. Now, getElementById is part of the document object, and it says go find me the element on the page with the ID equal p1. And it will go find that and return that to the user. Now, I put the word object reference in here because it's important to understand that document is a property of the window object that points to what's called the DOM or the DOM. It lists or tree of all the objects on the web page. We'll look at it in detail shortly, but it's important to understand that the window represents the physical window that you look on a web page, and the document represents all the HTML tags on the web page. Be object aware. Learn the patterns. Which element are we looking at here in the red box is an object? Which one's a method? Which one's a property? Turns out window is an object. We've established that before. Part of the window object is its document property, which also happens to be an object. Document is very clearly an object. Inside the document object is a method called getElementById. And I know it's a method because of these parentheses right here. And what I'm sending to it is a parameter. Go find me the element with the ID equal to P1. And it will return that element, an object from the DOM, and assign it to this obj variable. While document is by far the most important JavaScript built-in object because we'll use document more than anything else, keep in mind it's part of the window object, so the window object is just as important. There's much, much more to the window object. Why don't you Google JavaScript window object and read a few of the references, and it'll explain all the different parts of the window object. Again, the most confusing part about the window object is you don't have to type in window dot to use it. It's assumed that there's a window dot in front of alert. It's assumed there's a window dot in front of location. Next up, another very, very important built-in object, the document object. The built-in window object contains the built-in document object. Document is actually part of window. The window represents the browser window, the box that the page is displayed in. The document represents all the tags that's displayed on that web page. The built-in document object contains an object for every HTML tag on the web page. It's called the DOM, or the DOM. And if you put a bunch of H1 tags on your web page, then there'll be a bunch of H1 objects in the document object. You put a bunch of image tags on your web page, there'll be a bunch of image tags in the document object. It's called the DOM, or DOM, the document object model. When the browser displays your web page, it first makes an object out of every HTML tag, and then it displays the web page using those objects. The DOM represents every HTML element on your web page. The easy way to access each HTML element or object is by calling the getElementById method. Then you can change its inner HTML. So if you look at this line of code down here, I can go to the document object and say inside that, find something with ID 2. So there must be a tag on my web page that says ID equals ID 2. I'm going to extract and access that object. And once I have that object, I can change the way it looks on the web page, mostly by changing or accessing its inner HTML attribute or property. So let's do a real example. I'll put in some HTML that represents a web page and see how this is accessed or interacts with the DOM, or the document object model. First up is an H1 tag, and notice how I set an ID equal to head1. It will allow me down in the JavaScript to access that tag. When I get element by ID head1, it will be accessing this H1 tag, or this H1 object in the DOM. The ID attribute in the H1 tag allows JavaScript access to the H1 object. Order is important. GetElementById must execute after the H1 is displayed. You cannot execute this line of code before this H1 tag has been displayed on the page. Inner HTML. What does inner HTML mean? It's the HTML inside of a tag. See, between this P tag over here and this closing P tag over here, the inner HTML is everything inside that P tag. Surprise! Inside the box is inner HTML. All the HTML in between the P tag and the /P tag. When you change inner HTML, you change what is displayed in that paragraph. What I need you to do is start making the connection between what you see in the HTML and what you see in the JavaScript. I need you to understand when you see this ID equals head1, that's what we're accessing. When we use inner.html, we're talking about the HTML inside of a tag. Any tag, not just a paragraph. Could be a headline, could be an image, could be anything. HTML first. So these two lines of code, an H1 tag and a P tag, will display on the web page. First headline will come out in a big font because headlines are bigger fonts. Bold word will come out in a much smaller font because paragraphs are represented by smaller fonts. And I think you all know this by now. This is the web page that is rendered when it tries to display this HTML. This is just the simple display of the H1 and P elements on my crude browser window. JavaScript has created objects in the DOM for both tags. Every tag on the web page gets an object in the DOM. There's an object in the DOM that represents this H1 tag. There's an object in the DOM that represents this P tag. After the page is displayed and my headline and my paragraph are on the screen, I can then write JavaScript to access and or change the previous displayed elements I have on the screen. We're going to go to the document object. We're going to call its getElementById, and we'll extract the reference to the HTML with the ID equals head1. We're retrieving the object that represents this headline up here. and assigning it to the variable object. Object now points to an H1 object in the DOM. Object literally points to an H1 object within the DOM. Remember, the document object contains an object for every tag, not just these two, but every tag that's displayed on the web page. If you have 100 tags on your web page, you have 100 objects in your DOM. Each one of those objects has an element in the DOM. Now let's change that object that we accessed. Remember, what object is pointing to is that H1 tag. So go to the object that represents the H1 tag. The dot operator says go access the inner HTML variable inside that object and change it to second headline. Look what happened to the screen when we changed the inner HTML. I went to the object, said go to that H1 tag, and change the display to second headline. Now the original headline read first headline. What I did is I changed the code that was in between the H1 tags to now display second headline. We literally went inside the object to the inner HTML property. We replaced the first headline with the second headline in the DOM, which then changes the browser display. If you change any object within the DOM, you change what's viewed on the web page. Let's change the paragraph now. Let's go to document.getElementById, pass it a P1. I want to access the object in the DOM that represents this P1 tag on the web page. Once I have access to its object, I'm going to set its inner HTML to italic word, right? And these HTML tags here say italicize this output. What I've done here is I've replaced this bold tag with displaying bold word with this new italic tag displaying italic word. And once again, if I change the object in the DOM, I change what's displayed on the web page. We're literally going to the document object, calling its getElementById to extract reference to the HTML element with ID equal P1. We then change that object's inner HTML in the DOM, which changes what's displayed on the browser. You can change any tag/object in the DOM, and the web page will update. You change the wording of a headline, then you get a different headline on the web page. GetElementById is the #1 way to access a tag in the DOM, but it's not the only way. There are several other ways. You can also create and remove elements. If you wanted to get rid of that headline completely, you could delete it. If you wanted to add a second headline underneath it, you could add a second headline underneath it. Once again, if you change the DOM, you change the web page. You add a new tag to the DOM, you will see something new on the web page. It's very, very powerful, and it's used a lot in JavaScript. One more quick DOM example and see how changing the DOM changes the web page. We're going to start with a simple anchor link. ID equals A1. We're going to reference it to ESPN, and on the web page we'll display an ESPN tag that if you click on it, it will jump the web browser to ESPN.com. This is a standard HTML anchor link, that's why it's shortened to A, that will jump to the ESPN.com website. Notice the ID equals and the href equals. Those are called attributes of the anchor link. Attributes are part of the DOM object. There is an object in the DOM that represents this anchor link, and inside that object is the ID and the href. And if we can access them, we can change them. Switching over to JavaScript, this is how JavaScript would access that anchor link out there in the HTML and on the web page. I'm going to go to the document object. GetElementById will extract just this anchor tag or this anchor object, and I want to change its inner HTML to CNN. What I just changed was this ESPN. I changed it to CNN, and what's shown up on the browser is now CNN. Now I haven't changed the href yet, but I've changed the text of the link. Now I'm changing the href. Go to the document object, call it getElementById, and once again access the A1 reference. But this time, don't change the inner HTML, change the actual href. Instead of pointing to ESPN.com, I want this link to point to CNN.com. What I'm doing is I'm dynamically rewriting this tag. I'm dynamically redoing this link. I said I don't want to link to ESPN anymore. I now want to link to CNN. And after this point, after this code executes, if I click on the browser window on this CNN link, it will actually jump to CNN.com. Do you see how powerful the DOM is? Any attribute that an HTML tag has can be changed as long as that tag supports that attribute. The display does not change in this case with the href, but the link sure does. And when I click on the display link, it will jump to a whole new website. If that wasn't enough, you can actually add attributes that didn't exist before. What I did here is I came up to this tag and I changed this dynamically and I changed this dynamically. Now we're going to dynamically add a new attribute to this A tag, this anchor link tag. I'm going to go to the document, get element by ID, and I'm going to say access the A1 object. Access the object that represents this anchor link. And this time, I'm going to go to the style attribute. Now, I don't even have a style attribute, but if I put one in here, it will get a style attribute. And in the style attribute, I want to change the color of the link to blue. And look what happened. This changed to blue. I didn't like it as a black link. I said change it to a blue link, and it changed it. What I'm doing here is I'm adding a style attribute to the A tag. Now the DOM contains A ID equals A1, href equals CNN.com, style equals color blue, and the label is CNN. This was the original tag as it appeared on the web page. After I got through changing it through the DOM, this is actually what the web browser is displaying. If you change the object stored in the DOM, you're changing what shows up on the web page. Not only are you changing the visible part of the web page, you can change some of the stuff inside the object so it jumps to a different web address. Super, super powerful. Once you master the DOM, you've mastered JavaScript programming. Actually, this one's a little easier than the ones before. I'm going to go to the document object, and it has a title variable. Remember, objects are methods and variables. Get element by ID is a method, but it's not the entire document object. There is a title variable in it, and if you change it to CNN link, the title that gets displayed at the top of the browser window or in the tab for the browser window changes to CNN.link. This is a property that I didn't even show you over here in the document object, but it's there. So I'm ending with an easy one. Change the title of the web page in the DOM. Once you change the DOM, it changes the title shown at the top of the web page. Title must be a property of the document object or this line of code wouldn't work. And how do I know it's a property? No parentheses. Get element by ID is a method. It has parentheses and a parameter. Title has no parentheses, no parameter. It's a simple variable or property of the document object. Whew, that wraps up this portion of the slide. There are many, many ways to change the DOM, and the page display changes when you change the DOM. It's as simple as if you change the DOM, you change the page. It's a big part of how creating dynamic web pages in JavaScript. Don't believe me? Google JavaScript DOM or JavaScript document objects that kind of go to the same place, and you'll see much more information on the DOM or the document object. I use the term DOM and document object kind of interchangeably. DOM really just implies that I have a list or tree of objects for every element on the web page. That's what the DOM is. It is probably the most significant built-in object there is because it's the one we use most. If you want to change the web page, you change the DOM. Whew, one more and we'll wrap up this slide. The math object. The built-in math object is different than the window and the document built-in object. It's very, very different. They're all built in, but the math is going to be significantly different than the window and the document. We'll explain that shortly. Pretty obvious, but it provides math properties or constants and methods. Everything in the math object is math related. First, the math object properties are what we call constants. That means the values of the variables cannot be changed. What's that mean? Second, the methods are static, which means they do not change the property values. It's very, very different than the window or the document object where we're constantly changing the object variables. With the math object, you're not allowed to change the properties. The math object is built in, available. It's the same object for all JavaScript programs. That's the big difference on the math object. The window and the document objects are dynamically created for you and are very different from page to page. Right? If I have a page open on ESPN.com, I have a very different window object and document object than another page that is open on CNN.com. The window and the math objects reflect the page they are displaying. The built-in math object doesn't change from page to page. It's the exact same object for every web page. So it's the same math object for my web page as your web page as ESPN's web page. The math object does not change from page to page. It just provides math-related functionality to everybody's web page. Alert and pass it math.py. Ooh, what is that? Go to the built-in math object. The dot says go inside the math object and access the pi variable or property and display that value in the alert. Ooh, what did I just do here? I said go to the math object. The dot says go inside of it and access this pi variable and display it in an alert. And it did. Now I didn't have much room, so I had to kind of shorten it down here. But here you get the full 16 significant digits that the pi variable represents. The important thing to understand about the math variables is they are what's called constants. I cannot change their values. You cannot change their values. If you try to execute a line of code like math.py equals 3.14, let's say you didn't want all these digits after the 3.14, you can't do it. It's illegal. The math variables are constant. They're frozen. You cannot change them. So I can see what's in the pi variable, but I cannot, I repeat, I cannot change what's in the pi variable. Same for the e value in the math object. It's a constant. If I try to change it, I'll get an error message when my code tries to run. But I can display it and I can use it in the calculation. I just cannot change it. So like I say, math has variables or properties inside of it. Math also has functions inside of it, or methods better. Remember we were calling these variables before? A better name is properties. Properties indicates or implies that pi and e are variables inside the math object. Methods is the updated term. A method is simply a function that is part of an object, and it turns out this random method is part of the math object. So we're going to the built-in math object here. The dot says go inside the math object and access or run the random method. It returns the value from 0 to 0.99999. That's what the random method does. It produces a number between 0 and 0.99999. In this case, it randomly picked 0.27654932. That's what random does. It says here's a random number between 0 and 1. Now often that's not very useful, so let's kind of massage that random number and get a more useful number out of it. I'm going to take the number equals rand times 100. Now this has nothing to do with the math object. This is simple arithmetic. We're going to multiply the variable rand by 100 to shift the decimal place over 2 places, move the digits to 7. So when you multiply a number like this by 100, all you're doing is moving the decimal point over a couple of places. Now I have 2 digits to the right of the decimal point. Once I have them to the right of the decimal point, I'm going to go to the built-in math object. See the math dot there? That says go inside the math object. And this time run the floor method or function. What the floor method does is it rounds down. It chops off the decimal point. So what it's going to do is it's going to get rid of the 0.654932. It's just going to say get rid of it and leave me just the 27. Leaving the 27, which will be in the range of 0 to 99. Now, how can I say this number will always be between 0 and 99? Well, if my original random number had a 0.00 here, this would come out to 0. If my original random number had a 0.99 here, when I chopped off the decimal points, I'd have a 99 here. Getting a random number kind of takes 3 steps, especially if you want a random integer. All right, you got to call the random method, which gets you a floating point number. You got to shift it over a couple places, and then take the floor of it and get those 2 significant digits right there. Now, if I wanted a random number between 0 and 1, I wouldn't need to do the times 100 in the floor method. But if I want an integer, that's what I got to do. Power equals math.pow 2, 4. Go to the built-in math object, run the pow method, which is short for power, pass it a 2 to the power of 4 as parameter, and it'll return a 16. All right, this is sort of like the x to the y function on your scientific calculator. I want the power of 2 to the 4th power. 2 times 2 times 2 times 2 is a 16, and that's what it returns. Go to the math object, run the pow method. When you're done running the pow method, take the result back and assign it to the variable power. All of these methods are math related. Random, floor, power, square root, they're all math related functions because that's what's in the math object. Root equals math.square root, or SQRT, and pass it a 25. Go to the math object, run the square root function or method, pass it a 25. When it executes with the parameter of 25, it'll say the square root of 25 is 5 and return it to the root variable. It's not hard. There's plenty more methods out there. You just have to look them up and see what they are. I can't go over every one of them. There's like 20 or 30 of them. There is more to the math object. There are more constant properties at the top of it. There are more math methods in here. Just Google JavaScript math object to look what actions the math object will provide. Whew, that wraps it up. This has been the first video I've made in a while, so if my voice sounds a little shaky, it's just I got to get into the practice again of doing it. We'll see you in the next lesson. We'll see you on the next video. Have a good day, everybody.